The morning mist clung to the hills surrounding Sanh like a ghostly shroud, concealing the death that was about to unfold. Marine Lance Corporal Michael Thompson pressed his face against the cold metal of his M14 rifle, watching the fog roll across the desolate landscape of northwestern Quang Tri Province. It was January 20th, 1968, and Thompson had no idea he was about to witness one of the most brutal sieges in American military history. Colonel David Lones, commanding officer of the 26th Marine Regiment, stood in the command bunker at Sanh Combat Base, studying intelligence reports that made his blood run cold. North Vietnamese forces were massing in unprecedented numbers around the isolated fire base, positioned just 6 miles south of the demilitarized zone. The base, which had served as a critical strategic outpost in America's effort to monitor enemy infiltration routes, was about to become a killing ground. The first indication of the nightmare to come occurred when Company India of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, led by Captain William Dabney, ventured out on a reconnaissance mission toward Hills 881 South and 881 North. Thompson was among the 185 Marines who stepped into the elephant grass that fateful morning, their boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. As documented in the Naval History magazine's August 2023 issue, the North Vietnamese Army had positioned elements of 2 to 3 divisional size forces around the combat base, representing one of their largest concentrations of troops in the Vietnam conflict. The enemy's plan was methodical and terrifying in its scope. They intended to draw American forces into a protracted battle that would drain resources and morale while the Tet Offensive unfolded across South Vietnam. When the morning fog lifted around 1000 hours, Thompson saw the first black-clad figures moving through the tree line like deadly shadows. The crack of AK-47 rifles shattered the morning silence, followed immediately by the distinctive pop-pop-pop of Marine M16's returning fire. Captain Dabney's voice crackled over the radio, requesting immediate artillery support as his Marines found themselves engaged with an entire North Vietnamese battalion. Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, a 28-year-old career Marine from Ohio, watched in horror as mortar rounds began falling among his men. The enemy had positioned themselves with deadly precision, using the terrain to their advantage while unleashing a coordinated assault that demonstrated months of careful planning. Marines dug for cover behind fallen logs and into hastily scraped fighting positions. As the jungle erupted in violence, the firefight lasted for 6 grueling hours, with both sides taking heavy casualties. Thompson found himself crawling through mud and blood to reach a wounded comrade, Corporal James Rodriguez, who had taken shrapnel in his leg. The young Lance Corporal dragged Rodriguez to safety behind a massive boulder, his hands shaking as he applied a field dressing to the wound. "Stay with me, Rodriguez," Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible over the constant crack of rifle fire. "We're getting out of here." But as the sun began to set on January 20th, it became clear that this was not a simple patrol engagement. Radio intercepts revealed massive troop movements throughout the region, and aerial reconnaissance confirmed what Colonel Lones had feared most. The North Vietnamese were preparing for a prolonged siege of Sanh Combat Base. That night, as Thompson huddled in his fighting position listening to the distant sounds of enemy soldiers moving equipment through the jungle, he wrote a letter to his mother in Minnesota. "Dear Mom," he began, "I don't know when I'll be able to send this, but I wanted you to know that I'm thinking of you. Things are about to get real bad here, but don't worry about me. We Marines stick together." The next morning brought the official beginning of what would become known as the Battle of Sanh, a 7 to 7 day ordeal that would test the limits of American military resolve and the courage of 6,000 Marines trapped in an increasingly desperate situation. The earth-shaking roar of incoming artillery announced the true beginning of hell at Sanh. It was 0530 hours on January 21st, 1968, when the first North Vietnamese rocket slammed into the combat base's ammunition depot, creating a fireball that lit up the pre-dawn darkness like a miniature sun. Marine Lance Corporal Thompson was thrown from his cot by the concussion, his ears ringing as secondary explosions continued to rock the base. Colonel Lones emerged from his command bunker to witness a scene of organized chaos. The ammunition explosion had destroyed nearly all of the base's artillery shells and mortar rounds, leaving his Marines critically short of the firepower they would desperately need. In the coming weeks, flames reached 300 feet into the air while Marines ran for cover, as unexploded ordnance cooked off in the intense heat. Staff Sergeant Mitchell rallied his squad as more rockets and mortars began falling across the base perimeter. The North Vietnamese had positioned their artillery pieces in the caves and tunnels of the surrounding hills, making them nearly impossible to locate and destroy. Each incoming round was precisely aimed, targeting key installations and troop concentrations with deadly accuracy. "Get to the bunkers," Mitchell shouted over the explosions. "Move it, move it." His Marines scrambled across the open ground, diving into the network of underground positions that would become their homes for the next 2.5 months. Thompson grabbed his rifle and followed Rodriguez, who was still limping from his leg wound, into a reinforced bunker near the base's eastern perimeter. The bombardment continued for 4 hours, with over 100 rounds falling on the combat base. When the shelling finally stopped, an eerie silence descended over Khe Sanh, broken only by the crackling of fires and the groans of wounded Marines. Medical Corpsman William Hayes worked frantically to treat casualties in the 8th station, which had been damaged but remained operational. As reported in the comprehensive analysis by the Marine Corps' official historical documentation, the enemy's opening barrage represented a calculated strategy to isolate and demoralize the defenders while preventing reinforcement and resupply operations. The North Vietnamese had studied American tactics and knew that cutting off the base from outside support would create psychological pressure that might force an abandonment of the position. Throughout the day, reconnaissance flights revealed the true scope of the enemy buildup. Intelligence officers estimated that between 20,000 and 40,000 North Vietnamese troops were positioned in the hills surrounding Khe Sanh, representing the largest concentration of enemy forces in a single area during the entire Vietnam War. The Marines were outnumbered by at least 3-1, trapped in an exposed position with limited supplies and no easy means of evacuation. Captain Dabney's Company India, still holding their positions on Hill 881 south after the previous day's engagement, reported enemy activity on all surrounding ridgelines. Through binoculars, Dabney could see North Vietnamese soldiers moving openly during daylight hours, confident in their numerical superiority in defensive positions. The psychological warfare began almost immediately. Enemy loudspeakers positioned in the hills broadcast propaganda messages in English throughout the night. "Marines, you are surrounded," the metallic voices proclaimed. "Your position is hopeless. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to international law." Thompson and his fellow Marines listened to these broadcasts with a mixture of fear and defiance. "They're trying to get inside our heads," Rodriguez muttered, checking his rifle for the 100th time that day. "But they don't know Marines." The first major ground assault came on the night of January 21st. North Vietnamese sappers, specially trained infiltration troops, attempted to breach the perimeter wire using Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges. Marine sentries spotted movement in the darkness and opened fire, triggering a firefight that lasted until dawn. Private First Class David Kim, a 19-year-old Marine from California, found himself face to face with an enemy soldier in the wire. Both men fired simultaneously, Kim's M16 rounds finding their mark, while the North Vietnamese soldier's AK-47 burst went wide. Kim survived, but the encounter left him shaking as he realized how close death had come. By the end of January 21st, it was clear to everyone at Khe Sanh that this was not a typical engagement. The Marines were in for a long, bloody fight against an enemy determined to destroy them through attrition. Colonel Lone sent an urgent message to his superiors, request immediate reinforcement and resupply. Enemy strength estimated at division level. Situation critical. As the sun set on their first full day under siege, Thompson wrote another letter home. "The shooting has started in earnest now," he wrote. "We're surrounded, but we're not giving up. Tell everyone back home that the Marines are holding the line." The relentless pounding of artillery, mortars, and rockets became the soundtrack of survival at Khe Sanh. By February 1st, 1968, the Marines had endured 11 days of continuous bombardment, with enemy shells falling on the combat base at a rate of over 300 per day. Lance Corporal Thompson had lost 15 pounds, his uniform hanging loose on his gaunt frame as he peered through a periscope from his bunker toward the enemy positions. The North Vietnamese had turned siege warfare into a deadly science. Their artillery observers, hidden in caves throughout the surrounding hills, could call down accurate fire on any target within the base. Marines learned to move only during brief lulls in the shelling, sprinting between positions like rats in a maze designed by their enemies. Staff Sergeant Mitchell had developed a sixth sense about incoming rounds. "Get down," he would shout seconds before the whistle of descending shells reached their ears. His Marines had learned to trust his instincts completely, diving for cover whenever he spoke. This morning, as Mitchell led a patrol to check the perimeter wire, he sensed something different about the enemy fire patterns. Colonel Lones faced an impossible situation in his command bunker. Resupply flights could only land during brief windows when weather conditions and enemy fire permitted, often delivering only a fraction of the food, water, and ammunition his Marines needed. The base's 6,000 defenders were slowly being strangled by the siege, and Washington was pressing him for assurances that Sanh would not become another Dien Bien Phu. The comparison to the French defeat in Indochina 14 years earlier haunted everyone from the Pentagon to the foxholes of Sanh. President Lyndon Johnson reportedly kept a sand table model of the combat base in the White House Situation Room, studying it obsessively as he demanded hourly updates on the battle's progress. Captain Dabney's company India, still holding Hill 881 South, represented the base's most exposed position. The hilltop outpost was completely surrounded, receiving supplies only through dangerous helicopter flights that faced intense anti-aircraft fire. Dabney's Marines had dug themselves so deeply into the rocky soil that they lived like moles, emerging only to fight off enemy probes and direct artillery fire. The psychological pressure was becoming as deadly as the physical bombardment. Marines began showing signs of combat stress, their hands shaking uncontrollably as they cleaned weapons or wrote letters home. Hospital Corpsman Hayes worked around the clock treating not just physical wounds, but also the invisible damage that constant terror inflicted on the human mind. Thompson found solace in routine, methodically cleaning his rifle every morning and evening regardless of the circumstances. "Take care of your weapon, and it'll take care of you," he muttered, repeating the drill instructor's words from boot camp. Rodriguez, still recovering from his leg wound, had become Thompson's closest friend during the siege, the two Marines sharing rations and taking turns standing watch. According to Marine Corps' historical records, documented extensively in their official battle analysis, the enemy's strategy during this phase focused on wearing down American morale through constant harassment while building up forces for a decisive assault. Intelligence reports indicated that the North Vietnamese were constructing elaborate tunnel systems at forward positions under cover of their artillery barrages. The nights were the worst. Enemy mortars would begin falling just after sunset, forcing Marines into their bunkers for hours at a time. The psychological impact of lying helpless while shells exploded overhead created a special kind of terror that stayed with survivors long after the war ended. Some Marines began talking to themselves, carrying on conversations with invisible companions as their minds sought escape from the unending stress. Private First Class Kim had stopped writing letters home after witnessing the death of his best friend, Corporal Martinez, who was killed by a direct mortar hit while running between bunkers. Kim's letters had become increasingly dark and troubling, prompting his family to contact their congressman with concerns about their son's mental state. On February 5th, the siege took a dramatic turn when North Vietnamese forces launched a coordinated assault on the base's western perimeter. The attack began at 0200 hours with a massive artillery barrage, followed by infantry advancing under cover of darkness. Marine listening posts detected the movement and called in defensive fire, but several enemy squads managed to penetrate the outer wire. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was savage and desperate. Marines fought with rifles, grenades, and sometimes bare hands as enemy soldiers breached their defensive positions. Thompson found himself in a fighting hole with two North Vietnamese soldiers, the three men struggling in darkness lit only by flare light and muzzle flashes. When dawn broke on February 6th, 37 enemy bodies lay within the Marine perimeter, testament to the ferocity of the night's fighting. But the Americans had also paid a price: 8 Marines killed and 23 wounded in the assault. The message was clear: the North Vietnamese were probing for weaknesses, preparing for something much larger. Colonel Lones gathered his company commanders for a grim assessment. "Gentlemen," he said, studying the intelligence reports spread across his bunker's crude table, "this is just the beginning." The morning of February 23, 1968, brought a silence so profound that Marines throughout Sanh combat base felt their skin crawl with anticipation. After 33 days of relentless bombardment, the sudden absence of incoming artillery created an ominous quiet that veteran Staff Sergeant Mitchell recognized as the prelude to something terrible. Lance Corporal Thompson crouched in his fighting position, watching the mist-shrouded hills through the pre-dawn darkness. His hands trembled as he gripped his M14 rifle, not from fear alone, but from the physical deterioration that weeks of limited food and constant stress had inflicted on every Marine at Sanh. The average defender had lost 25 pounds, and many showed signs of malnutrition despite the heroic efforts of supply aircraft to break through the enemy siege. Colonel Lones received word at 0 for 100 hours that seismic sensors planted throughout the region were detecting massive underground movement. The North Vietnamese had spent weeks tunneling beneath the combat base's defensive perimeter, creating a subterranean network that would allow them to emerge directly inside American positions. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 40,000 enemy troops were now positioned around Khe Sanh, the largest concentration of North Vietnamese forces in the entire war. The assault began with a deception. At 0530 hours, enemy artillery resumed its bombardment, but with a different pattern. Shells fell primarily on the eastern and southern sectors, drawing Marine attention away from the northern approaches. Captain Dabney, observing from Hill 881 South, immediately recognized the diversion tactic and radioed a warning to the combat base. "Colonel, they're massing in the northern valleys," Dabney reported, his voice steady despite the desperate nature of their situation. "I count at least 2 regiments moving through the elephant grass," as documented in the detailed operational reports compiled by Marine Corps historians. The North Vietnamese battle plan called for a multi-pronged assault, designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers while preventing effective coordination between Marine units. The enemy had studied American defensive tactics and developed specific countermeasures for each aspect of the base's layout. The first wave struck at 0600 hours. North Vietnamese soldiers emerged from spider holes and tunnels that brought them within 50 meters of Marine positions, bypassing much of the defensive wire and creating chaos among the defenders. Thompson watched in horror as black-clad figures seemed to materialize from the earth itself, their AK-47 rifles already firing as they advanced. "Contact! Contact north!" Mitchell shouted into his radio, directing his squad to engage targets that seemed to appear from nowhere. The carefully prepared fields of fire that Marines had established over months of preparation became useless as enemy soldiers emerged inside the defensive perimeter. Private First Class Kim found himself facing 3 North Vietnamese soldiers who had climbed out of a tunnel entrance just 20 feet from his bunker. The 19-year-old Marine emptied his rifle magazine in seconds, his shots finding their marks. But more enemy soldiers continued emerging from the underground passages. Hospital Corpsman Hayes worked frantically in the aid station as casualties poured in from the fighting. The young medic had seen combat before, but nothing had prepared him for the volume and severity of wounds created by close-quarters combat. Marines arrived with injuries from rifle fire, grenade fragments, and in some cases bayonet wounds from hand-to-hand fighting. The battle raged for 8 hours, with Marines fighting desperately to prevent a complete breakthrough of their defensive positions. Artillery support from surrounding fire bases pounded suspected enemy concentrations, but the North Vietnamese had positioned their forces so skillfully that many shells fell dangerously close to American positions. Colonel Lones coordinated the defense from his command bunker, maintaining communication with isolated units and calling in air strikes when weather permitted. The colonel's convoys over the radio became a lifeline for Marines fighting for their lives across the combat base. "Hold your positions," Lones commanded. "Reinforcements are coming." But everyone knew that reinforcements were days away, and the Marines at Khe Sanh would have to survive on their own. Thompson dragged the wounded Rodriguez to a deeper bunker as enemy mortars began falling on their sector. Rodriguez had been hit again, this time by rifle fire, and was bleeding heavily from a wound in his shoulder. "I'm not gonna make it," Thompson, Rodriguez whispered, his face pale from blood loss. "Shut up with that talk," Thompson replied, applying pressure to the wound. "We're both getting out of here." As the day wore on, it became clear that the North Vietnamese assault was being contained, but at a terrible cost. 31 Marines had been killed and over 100 wounded in the fighting. The enemy had failed to overrun the combat base, but they had proven that Khe Sanh's defenses could be penetrated. As night fell on February 23rd, Thompson sat beside the unconscious Rodriguez in the aid station, writing what he feared might be his final letter home. "Mom," he wrote, "if something happens to me, tell everyone that we fought hard here. Tell them the Marines never quit." The siege was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. The thunder of aircraft engines cutting through the morning sky on March 1st, 1968, brought the first hope that Marines at Khe Sanh had felt in weeks. Operation Niagara, the massive American air campaign designed to break the North Vietnamese siege, was reaching its devastating crescendo. Lance Corporal Thompson looked up from his fighting position, to see formations of B-52 stratofortresses passing overhead like metallic angels of death. Their bomb bays loaded with enough explosives to reshape the surrounding landscape. Staff Sergeant Mitchell counted the aircraft through his binoculars, well B-52s in the first wave, followed by squadrons of F for Phantom jets and Marine A for Skyhawks. The air campaign represented the most intensive bombing effort in military history, with over 100,000 tons of ordnance dropped on enemy positions around Sanh over a 60-day period. The psychological effect on the Marines was immediate and profound. After 40 days of feeling trapped and helpless under constant bombardment, they could finally witness American military might being unleashed against their tormentors. Colonel Lone stood outside his command bunker, watching the bombs fall on enemy positions with grim satisfaction. The bombing runs were coordinated with scientific precision. Intelligence officers used electronic sensors, aerial photography, and captured enemy documents to identify target areas where North Vietnamese forces had concentrated. Each B-52 strike delivered approximately 60,000 pounds of explosives across a rectangular area called a box, creating devastation that could be heard and felt from miles away. Thompson and Rodriguez, who had recovered enough from his wounds to return to light duty, watched in awe as the hillsides around Sanh erupted in massive fireballs. Secondary explosions indicated that American bombs were finding ammunition dumps and supply caches that the enemy had carefully hidden in caves and underground bunkers. But the air campaign came with its own dangers for the defenders. Several bombing runs fell dangerously close to Marine positions, and communication breakdowns led to at least one incident where friendly fire wounded American personnel. Captain Dabney's company India on Hill 881 South found themselves directly beneath some of the flight paths, feeling the concussion of bombs exploding just hundreds of meters away, as documented in the official Air Force historical analysis of Operation Niagara. The bombing campaign represented a new form of warfare that combined strategic and tactical air power in unprecedented coordination. Forward air controllers, many of them Marines, worked around the clock to direct strikes while minimizing the risk to friendly forces. Hospital Corpsman Hayes noticed a significant improvement in Marine morale. As the bombing campaign intensified, Marines who had been showing signs of combat fatigue began joking and laughing again, their confidence restored by the visible evidence of American air supremacy. The constant thunder of aircraft engines overhead had replaced the whistle of incoming enemy shells as the dominant sound at Sanh. Private First Class Kim, who had been struggling with survivor's guilt after watching several friends die in the February assault, found new purpose in serving as a forward observer for the airstrikes. Kim's job was to watch for enemy movement and radio coordinates to aircraft controllers, directly contributing to the destruction of North Vietnamese positions. The bombing campaign also enabled limited resupply operations. Transport aircraft could land during brief windows when enemy anti-aircraft fire was suppressed, delivering desperately needed food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Marines watched these supply runs with intense anxiety, knowing that each aircraft represented their lifeline to the outside world. On March 5th, AC-130 transport aircraft was hit by enemy fire while attempting to land at Sanh. The pilot managed to crash land the burning aircraft on the runway, and Marines rushed to rescue the crew and salvage the cargo. 8 crewmen survived the crash, but the incident reminded everyone that the siege was far from broken. Colonel Lones received intelligence reports indicating that the bombing campaign was having a significant impact on enemy operations. Intercepted radio communications revealed confusion and low morale among North Vietnamese units, and the number of enemy probing attacks had decreased dramatically. However, intelligence also warned that the North Vietnamese were far from defeated and might be preparing for a final, desperate assault. The Marines at Sanh had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated enemy activity. When the bombing stopped in their sector, it often meant that North Vietnamese forces were moving through the area. When secondary explosions lit up the night sky, it meant that American ordnance had found hidden supply dumps. Thompson wrote to his mother about the change in their situation. "The flyboys are really giving it to Charlie," he wrote, using the military slang for enemy forces. "It feels good to have somebody on our side with some real firepower, but we're still not out of the woods yet." As March progressed, it became clear that Operation Niagara was succeeding in its primary objective of preventing a massive enemy assault on Sanh. The sustained bombing had disrupted North Vietnamese supply lines, destroyed artillery positions, and forced enemy troops to remain in deep bunkers, where they could not effectively coordinate attacks. But the siege continued, and Marines remained trapped in their underground world, counting the days until relief would finally arrive. The rumble of tank engines and the clatter of tracked vehicles approaching from the southeast sent a surge of electric excitement through the Marines at Sanh on April 1st, 1968. After 71 days under siege, rescue was finally approaching in the form of the 1st Cavalry Division's airmobile assault and the Marine Corps' own relief operation, codenamed Operation Niagara Falls. Lance Corporal Thompson climbed out of his bunker for the first time in weeks, without fear of enemy sniper fire, watching as helicopters from the 1st Air Cavalry began landing troops on the hills surrounding the combat base. The sight of fresh American soldiers, well-fed and carrying new equipment, highlighted just how much the siege had changed the defenders of Sanh. Colonel Lones received confirmation at 0800 hours that elements of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, had broken through the enemy's outer ring of positions and were advancing toward the base. The relief force had fought their way through prepared defensive positions, minefields, and ambush sites that the North Vietnamese had spent months preparing. Staff Sergeant Mitchell gathered his surviving squad members. Only 6 of the original 12 Marines remained, the others having been killed, wounded, or evacuated during the siege. Mitchell himself bore the scars of 7 to 7 days under fire, shrapnel wounds on his arms, 28 pounds of weight loss, and a tremor in his hands that he tried to hide from his men. The 1st Marine Relief Column entered Sanh combat base at 1400 hours on April 1st. Thompson watched in amazement as Marines from the outside world walked among the siege survivors, their expressions showing shock at the condition of the defenders. The relief Marines carried fresh rations, clean water, and meal from home luxuries that had become distant memories for the men of Sanh. Private First Class Kim, now a seasoned veteran despite his 19 years, served as a guide for the relief forces, showing them the elaborate tunnel and bunker system that had kept the defenders alive. Kim's transformation from frightened recruit to combat-hardened Marine illustrated the ordeal that every survivor of Sanh had endured, as documented in the Marine Corps' comprehensive after-action reports, compiled from extensive interviews with participants and official records. The relief of Sanh represented one of the most successful defensive actions in American military history. Despite being outnumbered by at least 4 to 1 and subjected to constant bombardment, the Marines had held their positions and prevented a significant enemy victory. Hospital Corpsman Hayes worked alongside fresh medical personnel to treat Marines who had been surviving on minimal medical care throughout the siege. Many defenders showed signs of malnutrition, exhaustion, and combat stress that would require weeks or months of recovery. Hayes himself had lost 35 pounds and suffered from severe sleep deprivation. Captain Dabney's Company India was among the last units to be relieved, holding Hill 881 South until April 8th, when helicopter evacuations finally removed them from their exposed position. Dabney's Marines had endured the entire siege in the most dangerous location, subjected to constant observation and fire from enemy positions. The reunion between siege survivors and relief forces was emotional but subdued. Marines who had shared 7 to 7 days of terror found it difficult to explain their experience to outsiders, even fellow Marines who had not lived through the siege. Thompson hugged his replacement, a young Lance Corporal fresh from the United States, and tried to convey the lessons of survival that had kept him alive. "Keep your head down and trust your buddy," Thompson advised. "And remember that no matter how bad it gets, Marines don't quit." Rodriguez, still weak from his wounds but determined to walk out on his own feet, packed his few remaining possessions into a sea bag that seemed pitifully small. After months of owning nothing but his rifle and the clothes on his back, the 2 Marines had formed a bond that would last the rest of their lives, forged in the crucible of shared survival. Colonel Lones conducted his final inspection of Sanh combat base on April 8th, walking through positions that had been home to his Marines for more than 2 months. The base showed the scars of the siege, destroyed buildings, crater-marked runways, and an elaborate network of bunkers and tunnels that resembled an underground city. Intelligence reports indicated that the North Vietnamese had withdrawn the majority of their forces from the Sanh area, moving them toward other targets as American strategy shifted away from static defense to mobile operations. The siege had served its purpose for both sides. The Americans had demonstrated their ability to hold prepared positions under extreme pressure, while the North Vietnamese had tied down significant resources and diverted attention from other operations. As evacuation helicopters began lifting the last Marines out of Sanh, Thompson took a final look at the place that had defined his understanding of courage, survival, and brotherhood. The 7 days at Sanh had transformed every Marine who lived through them, creating a select brotherhood of men who had faced the ultimate test and survived. The relief of Sanh marked the end of one of the longest and most intensive sieges in American military history, but for the survivors, it was only the beginning of a lifetime of memories that would never fade. The transport aircraft carrying the last Marines from Sanh lifted off on April 9, 1968, marking the end of 7 days that would forever define the meaning of courage under fire. Lance Corporal Thompson pressed his face against the small window, watching the scarred landscape of the combat base disappear beneath the clouds, knowing that part of him would always remain in those blood-soaked hills. The statistics of survival told only part of the story: 205 Americans killed in action, 1,600 wounded, and over 6,000 Marines who had endured one of the longest sieges in military history. But numbers could never capture the psychological transformation that every survivor carried with them for the rest of their lives. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, now wearing the chevrons of a gunnery sergeant after his promotion for heroism during the siege, sat quietly in the aircraft cabin, surrounded by Marines who had aged years in less than 3 months. Mitchell's hands had stopped trembling, but he still found himself listening for the whistle of incoming mortars, a reflex that would haunt him for decades. The journey to Da Nang Air Base took 2 hours, during which many Marines slept for the first time in weeks. Without the fear of being awakened by enemy bombardment, Thompson dozed fitfully, his dreams filled with the sounds and images of Sanh, the thunder of B-52 strikes, the screams of wounded comrades, and the face of every Marine who had not survived to see this day. Rodriguez, still weak from his wounds but determined to complete his tour of duty, spent the flight writing letters to the families of fallen Marines. As one of the longest survivors of the siege, Rodriguez felt a responsibility to share the stories of men who had shown extraordinary courage. In their final moments, his letters would become treasured keepsakes for families struggling to understand their loss. Upon arrival at Da Nang, the Sanh survivors were greeted by military officials, medical personnel, and journalists eager to document their story. The siege had captured national attention in the United States, with President Johnson and the Pentagon following every development. The successful defense of Sanh became a symbol of American determination. In the face of overwhelming odds, Private First Class Kim, now a veteran at 19 years old, struggled with the adjustment to life outside the siege environment. The constant noise and activity of Da Nang Air Base seemed overwhelming after months. In the underground bunkers of Sanh, Kim would require months of psychological counseling to address what military doctors were beginning to recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Medical examinations revealed the physical toll that the siege had taken on its survivors. The average Marine had lost 25 pounds, and many showed signs of malnutrition despite the heroic supply efforts during the siege. More concerning were the psychological effects: sleep disorders, anxiety attacks, and an inability to adjust to normal military routine, as documented in the comprehensive study conducted by military historians and preserved in the Marine Corps' Historical Center. The Battle of Sanh represented a turning point in American military strategy in Vietnam. The successful defense demonstrated that American forces could hold prepared positions against determined enemy assault, but the cost in resources and personnel raised questions about the sustainability of such tactics. Hospital Corpsman Hayes received the Bronze Star for his heroic service during the siege, having treated over 300 wounded Marines under the most difficult conditions imaginable. Hayes's medical logs, meticulously maintained throughout the 7 days, provided valuable information for improving combat medical procedures in future conflicts. Captain Dabney's Company India, the heroes of Hill 881 South, were awarded the Presidential Uni Citation for their extraordinary performance during the siege. Dabney himself received the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, in recognition of his leadership under fire. Thompson returned to the United States in July 1968, completing his 13-month tour in Vietnam. The young Marine from Minnesota found that civilian life required as much adjustment as combat had. Simple activities like sleeping in a bed or eating at a restaurant triggered memories of Sanh, and Thompson joined thousands of Vietnam veterans struggling to reintegrate into American society. The letters that Thompson had written home during the siege became family treasures, documenting the transformation of a young man from recruit to combat veteran. His mother kept every letter, eventually donating them to the Marine Corps' Historical Center, where they serve as primary source material for researchers studying the Vietnam War. Years later, survivors of Sanh would gather for reunions, sharing memories and maintaining the bonds forged during their ordeal. These gatherings served both as celebration of their survival and as memorial for the Marines who did not return home. The brotherhood of Sanh survivors became a lifelong connection that transcended differences in rank, background, or post-war experience. Colonel Lones, promoted to brigadier general after the siege, continued his Marine Corps career for another decade before retirement. Lones never spoke publicly about the political implications of Sanh, focusing instead on the courage and dedication of the Marines under his command. His leadership during the siege became a case study in military academies worldwide. The legacy of Sanh extended far beyond the 7 days of siege. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated air and ground operations, the importance of strong leadership under pressure, and the extraordinary resilience of the American fighting man when properly trained and equipped. For Thompson, Rodriguez, Mitchell, and the other survivors of Sanh, the siege represented the defining experience of their lives. They had faced the ultimate test of courage and endurance, discovering reserves of strength they never knew existed. The 7 days at Sanh proved that American Marines, when cornered and outnumbered, would never surrender. As Thompson often told audiences during Veterans Day speeches in later years, "We went to Sanh as boys and came back as men. We learned that freedom isn't free, and that sometimes you have to fight for every day you get to live." Those 7 days taught us what it really means to be Marines.